Marty, your background is so unique. You went from a clinical psychologist turned business leader and now executive coach. So, can you tell us a bit about your journey and what inspired you to write Blind Spotting?
Sure, Lauren. It's great to be with you today, so thank you. Um, yeah, it was not a planned journey. I think, like many of us, you kind of look back and you realized there was a fork in the road and you took it. So I trained as a clinical psychologist, and I thought that's what I was going to do and sit in my office and open the door every 50 minutes to a new patient. And I did that for about 10 years or so, but I, be, I became intrigued with the kind of the business of healthcare. And actually, this is a partial answer to one of the chapters in my book, which is about identity. My identity was as a clinical psychologist treating patients. And I really wasn't thinking about the fact that I really had been an entrepreneur on and off different times in my life, and it just wasn't part of my identity. But I drifted over that direction, ended up starting a healthcare business, and eventually closed my private practice. And then we sold the healthcare business, and I wasn't quite sure what to do next, but I looked for an opportunity basically to integrate both my being a clinical psychologist and the business. And so I became a leadership coach. And in terms of what inspired me to write the book, when I was a leadership coach, especially my clinical psychologist friends and others would be like, "What do you really do? I mean, what is that?" And I had long answers. And after a while, I figured out that really what I was doing was helping people with greater self-awareness. And as I thought more about that, that's really was the genesis for the book.
So, in the book, you define a blind spot as what we don't know about ourselves that holds us back as leaders. Why are blind spots so hard to see and even harder to admit? I mean, I know you mentioned that there's about six of these.
Yeah, I think it's just an error in the system and the way our brains work and the way we are that, we develop successful ways of negotiating situations and people and problems, and that narrows our kind of ability to respond in other kinds of ways. And we are successful probably 90% of the time. And so we don't really recognize when problems are showing up. And we tend to think that, if we can't solve the problem, it's not about us, it's about the problem's too hard, or it's somebody else, or the situation, or whatever it is. So it isn't a natural thing to begin to think about, hey, maybe my blind spot is that I could be reacting and behaving in a different kind of way. So to kind of get a handle on that, I have identified, as you mentioned, six blind spot areas and probably about 60 blind spots spread over those six areas. So the six areas are identity, motive, behavior, um, traits, emotions, and intellect.
Yeah, those sound like they would have a lot more blind spots in each area. Just like I know whenever we talk about things like behavior, you're like, well, that's a can of worms that, to your point, it's very hard for us to admit. It's something where like it's hard to change behavior. That's why there's a gazillion books on this. And even when you read it and you know what to do, it's still hard to do. So I imagine blind spots are sort of like when we think of that in our personal life, it's also that in work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does often require um, getting outside ourselves or actually other people who are can observe us in a more kind of objective way to help us kind of see where we just can't see because it's our normal way of responding.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start with identity, which you briefly touched on. What's an identity blind spot, and how does it quietly hold people back from maybe promotions or leadership recognition, anything that, in regards to career development and growth?
Sure. And each of the as we talk about these, each of the blind spots kind of show up in different ways. The identity blind spot tends to show up. Our identities are kind of the name tag we wear, kind of, when you describe yourself, it's who you say you are at a cocktail party or meeting somebody for coffee. So the blind spot in identity shows up when we move to a different role or we want to move to a different role and we're still holding on to the identity of our previous role. Maybe just one quick example. So I was engaged by a HR leader who was a VP of HR, the head of the HR department, but she wanted to be a corporate officer. She wanted to be the chief people officer. And she was being told by the CEO and others that she wasn't strategic. And so she really engaged me like, am I strategic or not? And that's a whole nother can of worms about what is strategic thinking. But um, I I asked her, tell me about yourself, and her identity was as the doer, getting things done. She was amazing at being able to handle multiple projects, execution, and so she was really, quite frankly, an order taker. Like we want this done, okay, I'll get it done, and she ran off and got it done. And what they were thinking about the CEO and senior team for, an executive corporate officer is a strategic person who asks why and starts to be a thought partner and a thought leader. And before you go, I mean, she didn't need to abandon the fact that she was good at executing, but she needed to expand her identity, that wasn't her first thing. And so we worked on that, and she did get the role promotion in about 4 to 6 months.
Amazing. I relate to that a lot. We actually just had an episode on, I'll put it in the show notes for anybody who has been, it's called What to Do When You're Told You're Not Strategic Enough, because I do think this is something that people are told often, especially when they're thinking about growth and leadership. Okay,
Yeah, I
another
think I think
go
just
on.
asking why and what questions are a good start to kind of being a strategic thinker.
Yeah, and I think I mean I really resonate to like they're an order taker. I'm very much a doer and executor. Like the minute we start talking about doing something, I'm like, okay, I'm already thinking on the 10,000 foot level versus still people are at that 30,000 foot
Right.
view. And
Right.
it is very much something I see people who are strategic or just people who are like they pause and then they act, and I'm very much like I act right away. And it to your earlier point about like mindfulness and sort of like watching your behavior, it does take like conscious thinking to be like,
Right.
okay, your knee-jerk reaction is go do this thing, but really you need to ask questions and understand the deeper why. And ultimately, if you end up having to execute on it, understanding the deeper why is
Right.
helpful, right? But yeah, so I relate a lot to
And
what you're saying.
and when you do that, you broadcast to others what your brand is. My brand is a doer. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just, you go there, and so that's the brand that you end up having. And yeah, so it's just like changing a corporate brand. You got to change your personal brand.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think that brand, the doer brand, is really great up to a certain
Yeah.
level. And then I hear this a lot where it's like whatever served you earlier in your career doesn't necessarily serve you later in your career when you are getting to those executive levels. So it is, for anybody who struggled with it, it's like, well, that's a good sign, I think, because it means that you
Right.
have to relearn a new way. Um, yeah, I want to talk about motive is another one
Sure.
of the six that you have. So, how can misalignment between our true motives and our job role quietly derail success? I would imagine that, if you're not motivated in what you're doing, that's going to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, the motive is really probably the hardest blind spot to get a hold of because this is the engine in the system, if you will. This is why we do things. This is what drives us. And we always have multiple motives. But if sometimes we're really not aware of the motives, other people do, right? I mean, people say, oh, he's only doing it for the money,
Yeah.
or he's only doing it to be in the spotlight. So, I mean, those are people saying that's what they're seeing as somebody's motive. And if the person's not aware of that and isn't, then obviously, their motive is misaligned with, the job, or misaligned with their team, or whatever it is. So getting a handle on what your motives are and being really clear about it and being strategic about it, and really struggling with that kind of, it's always hard to balance motives. Should I be, pushing for a promotion right now, or should I be quietly, supporting the team, or whatever the different motives are. So a misalignment with the motives is when you really get focused on a single motive and it starts to take over. And your clue to that usually is an emotional response, because when motives are blocked, we feel frustration. So when you're feeling an intense emotion, usually a frustration, that's a question to say, why am I so frustrated right now? What is really driving me?
So an example of that, like let's say your motive is money. You're like, I'm working because
Yep.
I want to pay my bills, and if I don't make $100,000 or more, like I'm not motivated to do this job or do a good job here. So how would that look? It's like, okay, I'm motivated by money. I asked for a raise and they didn't give it to me, and I feel frustrated, or I'm trying to see this in like an actual example.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so you do want to ask like really what are my motives? I mean, maybe the money motive as you really think about it, wasn't pushing you. So was pushing you, but it really wasn't your true motive. Maybe as you think about it broadly, I really love the mission of the company, or all these people I work with are really great. And it may mean a recalculation of I'm going to have to struggle with my money motive not being met, but these other motives do get met at this job. And so I want to really focus on those. If I keep focusing on the money all the time, I'm just going to be frustrated. Or maybe it means I need to switch jobs. This money motive really is number one for me, and I'm going to be frustrated all the time if it isn't being met, and I really need to, do something about that. So it's a real kind of a deep reassessment and audit of what your motives are.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was a recruiter before, and we used to always ask people when we get to the job offer stage, like, what are your top three things that you want to have in your next job? And I think there's a lot of ways to read into that, but it's almost like, what is your motivation for
Yeah,
taking this job? Is it because the mission, we would want to talk that more up? Is it money? We would want to talk more about like the whole compensation package. So to your point, I think understanding your motives also makes it easier for people on the other side of you to help you get
right.
what you need if that's it, if they can.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Great point about just being open about it all and vulnerable and sharing.
So you talk about traits becoming, quote, super
Yeah.
strengths turn supernovas. Can you give us an example of when leaning too hard on a strength becomes actually a liability?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the easiest motive or easiest blind spot to get a hold of. And every leadership book talks about what are the leadership traits. And traits are not unidimensionally good. You can think about some traits that you're really great at. You're really decisive, or you're really organized. And all you have to do is put the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too organized? What happens when you're too confident? And that's often what our partners and spouses and friends and colleagues tell us about us. And so knowing when those strengths tip over into becoming problems really is the key to kind of being aware of this blind spot. Just again, maybe a real quick example. I was working with a entrepreneur, CEO, leader, started a company, and he definitely was very confident, very decisive, really curious, kind of open to new ideas. And so his team really loved him until they didn't. And by that I mean he and a couple of people had left, and that's why he brought me in to try to help him take a look at this. They described him as arrogant, and really what was going on was that confidence and curiosity about, trying to figure something out. At some point, he figured out he had all the answers and he just didn't need to talk to anybody anymore. And the discussion was over, and he became dismissive towards people, not intentionally, but it just was obvious. And I couldn't tell him, you're arrogant. That wasn't something that he would ever really identify as. But I could help him see that when he stopped asking questions, he became very dismissive of his team, and that the tweak and the change was to be aware of that, and then to be able to say, you know what, I need to think about this a little bit more. I'm not almost ready to make a decision. How about we talk about it again, next Tuesday at our meeting or whatever. And certainly as he got to do that, he found out that he didn't have all the answers. Sometimes there was more information that came in. And he was generally he really wanted his team to like him. And so the change was something that he was able to do.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's moving too quick. Like
Yeah.
getting things done with urgency is really good, unless you're moving too quick and it's like, well, you did this thing before it was ready, or this thing went out and it had an error or something like that. It's like urgency is good, but sometimes you can be too quick on something.
Yeah, so kind of the check for you would be how do you pump the brakes a little bit on your urgency? What would give you a little clue to say, wait a minute, let me slow down just a minute, right now.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I want to talk about emotional blind spots. You kind of mentioned earlier that they're really tricky, especially for high performing professionals. What's one way that someone can tell if their emotions are managing them versus like I'm in charge of my emotions?
Yeah, that is the goal here. I mean, there's a number of things in the emotional area for blind spots, but it is about being more strategic and decisive about how you use your emotions. Actually, I find more executives, certainly more male executives, who feel like emotions are just a problem in the workplace. And the more, if everybody had no emotion, then everything would be just so much better. Um, I've worked with a lot of engineers who really look at the world that way, and I found myself saying to them, you know what? Emotions are just data.
Yeah.
There's whole data set you're not paying attention to. So, why don't you bring that data set in and pay attention to it? And if you can begin to be comfortable with your emotions and identify what you're feeling, then it allows you to use them strategically. The quiet leader who is calm all the time but is feeling some frustration, if they would actually pound the table in front of them, everybody's going to take notice, and it's going to be like, whoa, I better pay attention to this. And that would be like a strategic decision to let your emotions show a little bit, maybe in a way that's a little beyond what your normal ability is. So that's the emotional blind spot is a comfort level with emotions, a sophistication with it, and then ability to show them in a way that is authentic and also strategic.
Yeah, because I think having like an emotional reaction or emotions in general is very normal and
Right.
healthy. And like there's that book, The Body Keeps the Score, and it's sort of like, look, if you never feel anything, it's going to come out some other way. So I think it's healthy to have an emotion. I think the big thing is like, what do you do after you have the emotion? If you're really frustrated, do you just like vent about it to everybody who will listen for the next 3 years of your life? Or is it
Right.
like, here's the action I'm going to take and how I'm going to move on and be less frustrated, or maybe make it so that whatever this thing is that happened, I don't do it again in the future, or it doesn't happen again in the future.
And everybody reads our emotions. Nonverbals speak way louder than any words. So even if you're, trying to control that emotion of frustration, it's showing in some way. So my usual advice is advertise rather than conceal. Talk about it,
Yeah.
obviously in a way, like you said, that's constructive and moves things on. And you'll find that, that's, as you said earlier, as you share with other people, other people can help you problem solve.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a chapter called Intellect, and you write that being smart is never enough. Why do so many smart leaders still fail? I think this is so true. I see this all the time. Like the smartest person in the room is not necessarily the quote most successful.
Right. Yeah, and as a psychologist, my my discipline is guilty of fetishizing IQ, and the higher IQ, the better. Um, and I that in coaching, and you probably saw this when you were executive recruiting, people would just talk about how smart somebody was. I always hated the term wicked smart. I don't know what that actually really means, but but and it is something. And I certainly I talk in the chapter about four different kinds of intelligence, and um, I don't, it was almost more of a thought experiment in that chapter, but really, there are different kinds of intelligence. There is that IQ, which I call horsepower, just that ability to crunch a lot of data and remember a lot of things. And, that's associated with academic performance. There's speed of processing. Some people are just so quick on their feet, versus somebody that might be super smart and has to take a while to, come back with the answer. There are people that are just unbelievably creative and just see the connections that are not obvious, and that's a very different kind of intelligence. And then the fourth area I talk about is kind of street smarts, business acumen, that's just reading a lot of data. I always think of those people as kind of head on a pivot. They're just paying attention to everything. And yeah, I have met maybe one or two leaders that kind of are high in all of those. Most of us are high in some and not in others. And so my advice is to get the team to think about those different kinds of intelligence and construct a team where you've got all of that and you have a respect for all those different ideas. And that's where the team is going to come up with a way better answer than any one individual.
It's interesting. I thought you might also talk about someone who's like really good at influencing or the people. Like they're so charming. Like their intelligence is like almost that they have this ability to read people really well and recognize like I can influence the direction of this room based on kind of like that intelligence, but someone else is going to crunch the numbers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I put that part in my behavior chapter. I've talked
Oh,
about
okay.
behaviors, the complex behaviors, communication, influence, and prioritization. And I totally agree with you. I talk about 9 different types of influence techniques. And you're right. And the really successful leaders are very, and I think this is also true of politicians, people that are in the public. They really have a sensitivity to what's the right tool out of my toolbox of influence to use. Is it, do it for the team? Is it do it for me? Is it analytical, argument? Is it whatever it is, and figuring out kind of how to use different ways of influence.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I see this all the time in work too. It's like the people who I'm like, wow, you just got this thing connected to this
Yeah.
thing way faster than if we had done a whole data analysis about it because you like quote sold it. You influenced them to be like, yep, we're on board with that. So I'm always very impressed with that skill set. Okay, obviously behavior seems like the most obvious blind spot to fix, but it's also usually the one most ignored. Why is that? Is it because it's the hardest? Is it because we are always told to change our behavior and it feels like
Yeah, and well, I think so. All these other the behavior is what everybody sees, and it's what we see, right? These other blind spot areas that we just talked about are a little more hidden, but they all show up in your behavior. So the direction of the book is figure out these other blind spots first, because and then it does mean you're going to change some behavior, like a couple of these examples I've given, but it's changing those in service of a blind spot that's at another level, your traits or your emotions or something. But in the behavior chapter, I talk about, as I said, communication, influence, and prioritization. I think the prioritization one is an interesting one, to your point about kind of what we're not aware of. There was an article written by the CEO of Procter& Gamble about 10 years ago, and he talked about what can only the CEO do. And it was just a kind of an eye-opening article for me, adding that word only and thinking about it as the role. And this is true of any role that you have. There are some things that only you in that role can do because that is what that role is for. And if you're not prioritizing that, if you're doing what you're really good at or what you like to do or what other people tell you to do or what the meeting's about, then you're not really thinking about what only you can do in your role. And this is where, time management comes in and being able to do it. So just I talk about five things a CEO can only do. CEO can only choose their senior team. I mean, if they're letting HR do that or somebody else, then they're not doing what only they can do. They only can really make the major strategic decisions about where the company's going and really own those. They can set the priorities for the year and making sure the resources are aligned along those and people don't drift from those priorities. They're the champion of the culture. I mean, the way they behave, the way they talk, they need to own that culture all the time and be thinking about it. And finally, they own certain relationships. That's also true of other roles. And being really clear on only you in that role is who people want to talk to. And what are those key relationships that you need to own and you need to manage? And if you're doing those five things, then you can do everything else that you may want to do, but you better make sure you're checking the box in all of those.
yeah. I'm kind of curious with these blind spots. Maybe this isn't possible, but is there any way to like avoid having these? Is it like, look, self-awareness is step one, and while you can't avoid them, you can make them less of a blind spot, or
I think this is just how this is the operating system we all have as humans. I mean, we are pattern recognition people, and when we recognize patterns, and we start to focus on those, and we exclude other kinds of information. So it is about being self-aware. It isn't about being perfect. It is about not being judgmental about our blind spots. They just are, and let's just figure it out. It's those strengths are strengths, and you don't need to apologize for them. You just need to figure out when you're tipping over and using it too much. Um, so, I mean, in the book, I have a number of exercises people can do to try to get self-awareness. We have a blind spotting test, blindspotting.com, where you can take a quick test to try to figure out where your blind spots are. And we're all very busy. So pick one at a time and just kind of begin to make these small tweaks that are going to help, minimize the effect of your blind spots.
yeah, that's what I was going to ask next is like, how do you, I mean, there's obviously a potential for a lot of them. So it's like, how do you narrow down what to start with? And it sounds like taking this test is like a really good first place mixed in with the book, like they work together.
Yeah, I think about where to start. Yes. And where to start is either where you are already identifying you're frustrated, or where other, 360 feedback is a great place. What are people telling you? One of the insights that started my book is when I did 360s, we tended to look at what are the strengths and what are the opportunities, and you think of those as two separate buckets. Well, really, they're the flip side of the same thing. And as I started to realize that, some of those strengths and were the other side were the opportunities, and you could hear that through 360 feedback. That, will help people give an idea of kind of where to start as a first step.
Yeah, I feel like you know you have a blind spot that's kind of derailing your success if
Right.
you are having any of these things and not, and this isn't a bad thing, as your to your point, we're all humans. This is just like part of our operating system. And so this is just another tool to put in your toolkit, which is always very helpful to have a wide variety of those. So Marty, any parting words, like last things you would tell someone who's maybe feeling like I know I have a blind spot, like I recognize this.
I mean, the book is about self-awareness, and I think, there's lots of really great leadership books. I mean, you and I could read the same book on how to lead a good team meeting, and we could each take away the same five key takeaways, but we do them differently because we have different personalities, different approaches. And so understanding yourself is going to just make you so much more strategic and decisive and about how you really apply all these, lessons you can learn in leadership. So, I think, just this kind of developing a habit pattern of becoming more and more self-aware.
Yeah. Well, we are really big on the show about proactive career development. So this definitely fits into that bucket. Marty, tell people where they can find your book, learn more about you, follow your work, all the things we'll put in the show notes as well.
Thank you very much. So the book is coming out from Harvard Business Review, HBR Press, July 29th. And so buy it wherever you buy your books. And you can also find me on martindubin.com. And the best place to find all this information about the book and everything is at blindspotting.com.
Amazing. We'll put all of that in the show notes as well as the blind spotting test that you mentioned. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Great. Thanks for the conversation. I loved it.